The year was 1887, and the silence of Elias Vance's ranch was a living thing. It was a pressure in the air, a weight that settled in the hollows of the land and in the deeper hollows of the man himself. For 5 years, since the day he had buried his wife, Martha, and the stillborn son she had died giving birth to, silence had been his only constant companion. It was in the dust motes dancing in the lonely shafts of afternoon light that pierced the cabin's gloom, in the vast, empty sweep of the Montana sky, and in the unspoken words that died on his tongue before they could ever form a sound. His life was a testament to routine, a bulwark against the tide of grief that threatened always to pull him under. He rose before the sun painted the eastern peaks, his movements precise and economical. He mended fences that bordered nothing but more emptiness, his hands, calloused and competent, working the wire and wood with a grim focus that left no room for thought. He tended his small herd of cattle, their lowing the only sound that didn't feel like an intrusion. He was a man carved from the same hard rock and unforgiving timber as his surroundings, weathered, solitary, and shut fast against the world. The cabin itself was a reflection of his soul. It was clean, orderly, and stripped of all softness. The rocking chair Martha had loved sat motionless by the cold hearth, a silent monument to a future that had turned to ash. The small cradle he had painstakingly carved, its wood smooth as river stone, was tucked away in the loft, shrouded in canvas and sorrow. Elias existed not in the present, but in a long, unchanging twilight of what had been, his heart a locked room to which he had long ago lost the key. Then came the blizzard. It was an unseasonable fury, a white monster that descended from the mountains in late autumn without warning. The sky, which had been a placid blue only that morning, turned the color of a deep bruise. The wind began to howl, not like a simple gust, but like a thing grieving, its voice tearing at the eaves of the cabin and scouring the land with ice and snow. For 2 days, Elias was a prisoner in his own home, the world outside erased, reduced to a roaring, blinding whiteness. He kept the fire stoked, rationed his supplies, and listened to the storm's rage, feeling a strange kinship with its senseless violence. On the 3rd morning, the wind finally wept itself into exhaustion. A fragile, crystalline silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. Elias pulled on his thickest coat and stepped outside into a world transformed. The snow was a deep, immaculate blanket, swallowing fences and sculpting the familiar landscape into something alien and new. It was during his slow, trudging survey of his property line, checking for drifted cattle, that he saw it, a dark shape, nearly consumed by the snow, that did not belong. It was the broken spine of a prairie schooner. One wheel was shattered, its spokes jutting out like broken bones. The canvas top was ripped and sagging under a heavy load of snow. A profound stillness hung over the wreck, the kind of absolute quiet that speaks of finality. Elias approached with a grim sense of foreboding, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He knew what he would likely find, another testament to the land's cruel indifference. He pulled back the frozen flap of canvas. The interior was a cramped, frozen cavern. A woman lay on a thin mattress, her face pale and serene, her eyes closed against a world that had offered her no mercy. She was frozen solid. It was a tragedy, but one Elias had steeled himself to expect. What he did not expect was the movement. From beneath the woman's heavy wool cloak, something stirred. Elias's heart, a slow and sluggish muscle in his chest, gave a painful lurch. He reached in, his fingers clumsy with cold and shock, and pushed aside the cloak. Huddled against her mother's cold body, a small girl with wide, terrified eyes stared up at him. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, her face smudged with dirt and tears. She clutched a bundle wrapped in layers of blankets, holding it with a ferocity that belied her size. "Heater's broken," she whispered, her voice a tiny, cracked thing. "Mama won't wake up." Elias didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat was a knot of rust and disuse. He simply reached for the child, his movements slow and deliberate, trying not to frighten her more than she already was. She flinched, but didn't resist, her small body stiff with cold. As he lifted her, he saw that the bundle in her arms was not a doll. From within its depths came a faint, mewling cry, a sound so fragile it was nearly lost in the vastness of the snow-drowned world. A baby, a newborn. The silence of his life was not just broken, it was shattered into 1,000 pieces. He stood there in the wreckage, holding a trembling little girl and staring at the impossible, infinitesimal life she held in her arms. The past and present collided with the force of an avalanche, and Elias Vance, the man who had walled himself away from the world, was suddenly, terrifyingly, at its very center. He carried them back to the cabin, the little girl a feather-light weight in one arm, his mind a maelstrom of panic and denial. The baby, still wrapped in its bundle, remained clutched in the girl's protective embrace. He pushed open his cabin door and was struck by the suffocating quiet within. It was the same quiet he had lived with for years, but now it felt different. It felt like an accusation. He set the girl down gently near the hearth. She immediately scrambled to check on the baby, her small fingers unwrapping the blankets with a practiced care that was heartbreaking to witness. The infant was terrifyingly small, its skin tinged blue, its cries weak and thin. Elias moved on instinct, his long dormant protective urges overriding his paralysis. He stoked the fire until it roared, filling the room with a heat that felt like a prayer. He filled a basin with warm water, his hands shaking as he tested the temperature. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Cora," she replied, her eyes never leaving the baby. "And the baby?" "Rose." Rose. The name was a phantom pain, a ghost of the name he and Martha had once considered for a daughter they would never have. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the immediate, overwhelming reality. The baby needed to be warmed, it needed to be fed. He had no woman's clothes, no milk, nothing. He was a cattle rancher. He knew how to pull a calf from its mother in a blizzard, how to set a broken leg, how to face down a wolf. He did not know the first thing about keeping a human infant alive. Desperation was a sharp spur. He thought of the cow that had calved just before the storm. He took a pail and disappeared into the biting cold, returning minutes later with a small amount of rich milk. He diluted it with boiled water, a crude and probably incorrect concoction, and tried to feed the baby using a strip of clean cloth dipped in the warm liquid. Rose fussed and cried, but eventually she began to suckle weakly, taking in the barest amount of nourishment. Cora watched his every move with an unnerving intensity. Her gaze was old, filled with a solemnity that did not belong in the face of a child. She was the sentinel, the guardian, and he was the stranger whose every action was being weighed and judged. For 2 days, this was their rhythm. Elias fumbled through the tasks of survival feeding the baby, making thin broth for Cora, keeping the cabin warm while the storm's remnants kept them locked away from the world. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions and shared, unspoken grief. Elias worked, his hands and body moving through the familiar chores, but his mind was in a place it had not been for 5 years. It was a place of fear and terrible responsibility. Each of the baby's cries was a blade that scraped against the scarred tissue of his heart. Each of Cora's watchful glances was a reminder of his inadequacy. On the 3rd evening, the baby, Rose, began to wail with a relentless, inconsolable grief. Elias had tried everything. He had fed her, changed her soiled wrappings with clumsy fingers, and walked the floor with her until his arms ached. Nothing worked. Her cries filled the small cabin, echoes of a loss too profound for such a tiny being to contain. He was failing. The thought was a cold stone in his gut. He finally sank into the rocking chair, the one he never used, and held the screaming infant against his shoulder, his body rigid with despair. Cora, who had been sitting silently on the floor, stood up and walked over to him. She looked from his grim, exhausted face to her wailing sister. Her small brow was furrowed with a seriousness that made her look like a miniature adult. She reached out a tiny hand and laid it on his arm. He looked down at her, surprised by the touch. "Mister?" she asked, her voice small but clear in the momentary lull of the baby's cries. He just looked at her, waiting. She took a breath, her gaze unwavering. "Can you help me find a mama for my new baby sister?" The question struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. It was not a child's innocent query, it was a plea born of a loss she was only just beginning to comprehend. It ripped through the careful fortifications he had built around his heart, tearing open the door to that locked room of his grief. He saw Martha's face, pale and still. He felt the crushing weight of the tiny, lifeless body of his son. All the pain he had buried under years of silence and hard labor came rushing back, a tidal wave of sorrow that threatened to drown him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. He just stared at this small, determined girl who was asking him to fix a world that was irreparably broken, to find a replacement for the mother who lay frozen in the snow less than a mile away. And in that moment, he felt the first crack in the ice that had encased his heart for half a decade. He had no answer for her, none at all. But as he looked down at the screaming child in his arms and the desperate hope in her sister's eyes, he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that he had to try. He began to rock the chair, a slow, hesitant movement at first, then more steady, a rhythm of reluctant comfort in the vast, waiting silence. The days that followed were a crucible. The blizzard's retreat left them marooned in a world of stark white and brilliant blue, the cabin an ark on a frozen sea. Elias had to deal with the grim necessity of the dead woman in the wagon. With Cora inside, distracted by the task of watching Rose, he hitched his strongest horse to a sled and made the solemn journey. He brought the woman's body back and laid her to rest in a deep grave he dug in the frozen earth of the small, wind-swept plot where Martha and his son lay. He said the Lord's Prayer over the raw mound of earth, the words feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue, but necessary. It was an act of respect, a closing of a chapter he had never asked to be opened. Inside the cabin, a fragile new ecosystem was forming. The rigid, silent order of Elias's life had been replaced by a chaotic, demanding, and strangely vital clutter. Damp swaddling cloths hung drying by the fire. The air smelled of warm milk and wood smoke. The endless quiet had been filled with the gurgles, cries, and soft coos of a baby, and the soft, inquisitive hum of a little girl. Elias found himself changing in small, incremental ways he barely noticed. He learned to differentiate Rose's cries, sharp, piercing demand for food from the fretful whimper of discomfort. He learned to warm her swaddling by the fire before wrapping her in it, a trick he discovered after watching her shiver. He found his voice, not just for necessities, but for small things. He would murmur to the baby as he rocked her, nonsensical reassurances that were as much for himself as for her. Cora was his silent, observant partner. She did not play. The gravity of her situation had burned away such frivolities. Instead, she helped. She would bring him a clean cloth before he asked for it. She would sit by the cradle and sing a soft, tuneless lullaby her mother must have sung to her. She began to talk to him, not in pleas, but in statements. "Rose likes it when you walk with her by the window. Mama used to make Johnny cakes." One afternoon, while Elias was trying to repair a small leather strap on the cradle, Cora came to stand beside him. Her eyes were fixed on a high shelf near the fireplace. On it, gathering a fine layer of dust, sat a small, intricately carved wooden horse, its painted mane faded. "Who is that for?" she asked. Elias's hands stilled. He had forgotten it was even there. "I made that," he said, his voice quiet, "a long time ago." "For a boy?" He didn't look at her. He just nodded, his throat tight. He expected her to ask more, to probe the wound, but she didn't. She simply reached out and gently touched the wooden horse's nose. "It's a good horse," she said softly, then turned and went back to her vigil by the cradle. In that small moment of shared, unspoken understanding, another layer of ice melted. He began to see her not just as a responsibility, but as a persona, small, resilient soul who had witnessed more horror than anyone should, and yet still possessed a core of unwavering strength. And he realized with a jolt that she was beginning to see him too, not as a fearsome stranger or a temporary solution, but as a source of safety. He was the one who made the fire roar, who provided the food, who could lift her up to see the tops of the snow-laden pines through the window. When the path to town was finally clear enough to risk, a new kind of dread settled over him. Blackwood Creek was a 10-mile ride, a place of commerce and community he had avoided for years, visiting only for absolute necessities. He knew what awaited him there: questions, suspicion, judgment. A reclusive bachelor, appearing after a storm with 2 orphaned children and a story of a dead mother, was the very definition of gossip and scandal. He bundled the children as warmly as he could, securing Rose in a sling against his chest and placing Cora behind him on the saddle of his most placid mare. The ride was slow, the air still biting. Cora's small arms were wrapped tightly around his waist, her face pressed against his back. He could feel her trust in the solid weight of her, and it fortified him. Blackwood Creek was just as he expected. As he dismounted in front of the general store, windows steamed up and faces appeared. Whispers followed him like his own shadow as he stepped inside. The store owner, Mr. Shaw, a man with small, calculating eyes, looked from Elias to the bundled children with undisguised curiosity. "Vance," he said, his tone a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Didn't figure we'd see you till the spring thaw." "Ran into some trouble," Elias said, his voice flat. He explained the situation in as few words as possible: the wrecked wagon, the dead mother, the children. He kept his account factual, devoid of emotion, but he could feel the atmosphere in the store shift from curiosity to a sharp, predatory interest. A woman at the back of the store, Mrs. Prescott, the minister's wife and the town's self-appointed moral compass, stepped forward. Her face was pinched with a look of pious concern that barely masked her voracious appetite for a good tragedy. "Oh, the poor dears. A man alone is not fit to care for children, especially not a newborn. They must be exhausted, frightened, and filthy," she added, her eyes flicking over their worn clothes. "They should be brought to the church. We will see that they are properly cared for until the circuit judge can arrange for the orphanage." The word orphanage landed like a stone in the quiet store. Elias felt Cora's hand, which had been clutching his coat, tighten into a fist. He looked down at the top of her head, then at the sleeping face of the baby nestled against his chest. An unfamiliar fire surged through him, a hot, protective anger that burned away the last vestiges of his apathy. The orphanage meant separation. It meant cold cots and threadbare blankets and a life of being unwanted. It was another kind of death. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it had the finality of a slamming door. Every eye in the store was on him. Mrs. Prescott's lips thinned. "Mr. Vance, you must be practical. This is not your affair. You are a single man. What can you possibly offer them?" Elias looked directly at her, his gaze steady and hard. For 5 years he had let the world's judgment slide off him, content in his isolation. But now, that isolation was no longer a fortress. It was a cage he was breaking out of. He was responsible for these lives. He was their only defense against the cold charity of the world. "I can offer them a home," he said, the words tasting new and powerful in his mouth. "They'll be staying with me." He gathered his supply-scanned milk, softer cloth, a few other necessities, paid Mr. Shaw with a firm hand, and turned to leave. He could feel the weight of their stares on his back, a mixture of shock, disapproval, and condemnation. They saw a rough, unsuitable man making a foolish claim. But as he stepped out into the cold, clear air, with a child's hand in his and an infant's warmth against his heart, Elias Vance felt more capable and more whole than he had in a very long time. He knew this was not the end of it. The town would not let it go. This was just the beginning of a new fight. The confrontation came sooner than he expected. A week later, as a pale winter sun was setting, casting long blue shadows across the snow, he saw them coming. A sleigh, carrying 3 figures, was making its way up the track to his cabin. He recognized the stout form of the minister, Mr. Hale, the rigid posture of his wife, Mrs. Prescott, and the officious bulk of the store owner, Mr. Shaw, who also served as the town's part-time constable. Elias's heart settled into a low, heavy drumbeat. He had known this was inevitable. He sent Cora to sit by the fire with Rose, who was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, the very cradle he had once thought would remain forever empty. "Stay here," he told her, his voice calm, betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. He stepped out onto the porch as the sleigh pulled to a stop. The air was cold and still. The 3 of them disembarked, their faces grim and determined, a small delegation of righteousness come to enforce the will of the community. "Vance," Mr. Hale began, foregoing any pleasantries, "we've come to take the children. It's for their own good." "Their good is being seen to right here," Elias replied, his voice even. He didn't move from his position in front of the door, his body a quiet, unyielding barrier. Mrs. Prescott stepped forward, her expression one of exasperated pity. "Mr. Vance, we have discussed this at length. You are not equipped. This is no place to raise a young girl and a baby. It is a place of sorrow." She let the word hang in the air, a cruel and deliberate jab at his past, at the graves that lay just beyond the cabin. They need a woman's touch. They need civilization. The orphanage in Helena is a fine institution. "They will not be separated," Elias said, his gaze fixed on her. "And they will not be sent away. Their mother died trying to get them to family. She didn't want them with strangers. And you are not a stranger." Shaw scoffed, hitching up his trousers. "You're a hermit, Vance. What life can you give them? A life of silence and dirt? The law will see it our way when the judge arrives." "The law isn't here yet," Elias said, his voice dropping lower. "And until it is, they are under my protection. This is their home." The word home hung in the frigid air, imbued with a meaning he was only just beginning to understand. It wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was a promise. It was safety. It was a place to belong. The argument escalated, their voices rising in the twilight. They spoke of propriety, of Christian duty, of what was best for the children, their words a barrage against his quiet resolve. Elias stood his ground, meeting their accusations not with anger, but with an unshakable certainty that felt forged in the very core of his being. He thought of Cora's question, her plea to find a mama for her sister. He couldn't give her that, but he could give her this. He could give her a fortress against the world's cold logic. He was about to tell them to leave his property when the cabin door creaked open behind him. He turned his head slightly. Cora stood there, a small silhouette against the warm light of the fire. She had obviously heard every word. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but there was no fear in them. There was only a fierce, solemn resolve that mirrored his own. She walked across the porch, her small boots making no sound on the weathered planks, and came to stand beside him. Without a word, she slipped her small, warm hand into his large, calloused one. She squeezed it. It was not a gesture of a child seeking comfort. It was the gesture of an ally, a partner. She stood shoulder to shoulder with him, facing down the world. The delegation fell silent. They stared at the scene before them, the big, hardened rancher and the tiny girl, their hands clasped, presenting a united and unbreakable front. In that moment, they were not a reclusive man and an orphan. They were a family. The sight disarmed them more effectively than any threat or argument could have. It was a truth so plain and powerful it could not be denied. Mr. Hale cleared his throat, his certainty wavering. Mrs. Prescott's lips were a thin, disapproving line, but for the first time she had nothing to say. It was Mr. Shaw who finally broke the standoff, though not in the way Elias expected. He looked at the joined hands, at the defiant set of Elias's jaw, and he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "The man's made his choice," he said gruffly, turning back toward the sleigh. "Nothing more to be said here, not for now." The minister and his wife, their righteous crusade deflated, followed him. They climbed back into the sleigh, their departure as quiet and awkward as their arrival had been confident. Elias watched them go, the sleigh runners squeaking on the cold snow until they were just a dark shape receding into the gathering night. He was still standing there, Cora's hand still firmly in his, when he realized he was trembling, not from cold, but from the aftermath of the battle. He looked down at the little girl beside him. She was looking up at him, her expression serious. "You won't let them take us?" she asked, a confirmation, not a question. "No," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't, ever." He squeezed her hand back, a promise sealed. He led her back inside, into the warmth and the light, closing the door firmly on the cold and the judgment of the outside world. He had faced down his ghosts and the town's prejudice, and he had won, for now. But as he looked at the sleeping baby and the resolute little girl, he knew his life of solitude was over for good. A new life, one of immense and terrifying and beautiful responsibility, had just begun. The passing seasons wove a new kind of life into the fabric of the ranch. Winter slowly released its grip, the snow receding to reveal the sleeping earth beneath. With the spring came a tentative thaw, not just in the land, but in the town of Blackwood Creek. The story of Elias Vance and his stand for the two orphan girls became a piece of local law. The initial condemnation slowly morphed into a grudging respect. Mrs. Prescott still sniffed with disapproval when his name was mentioned, but other voices began to emerge. Mr. Shaw's wife, a kind, quiet woman named Ada, started leaving a small sack of flour or a jar of preserves on his wagon whenever he came to town for supplies. She never said a word about it, but her eyes held a quiet approval. Elias, with the help of a sympathetic Mr. Hale who had been moved by the scene on the porch, navigated the legalities. When the circuit judge finally arrived, he heard the story not just from the minister, but from Elias himself. He saw the clean cabin, the healthy, thriving baby, and the little girl who shadowed Elias's every step. He saw a home. The adoption was formalized, and Cora and Rose legally became his daughters. Life on the ranch was no longer silent. It was a symphony of new sounds. It was Cora's endless stream of questions as she followed him on his chores, her voice bright with curiosity. "Why is the sky blue, Elias? Can cows get lonely? Will you teach me to ride?" It was the sound of Rose's happy gurgles as he held her, her tiny hand gripping his finger with surprising strength. It was the sound of his own voice, deeper and more frequent than it had been in years, explaining, teaching, and sometimes even humming a rough, tuneless song as he rocked the cradle. The cabin transformed. Cora's small drawings were tacked to the wall. A second, smaller chair appeared by the hearth. The rocking chair was in constant, gentle motion. The ghosts of the past did not disappear entirely, but they receded. The memory of Martha and his son was no longer a raw, open wound, but a scar that he carried with a quiet sorrow, a part of the man he had become. He now had new lives to focus on, a new purpose that pulled him insistently into the present. He taught Cora the names of the wildflowers that bloomed in the meadow and the calls of the birds that returned in the spring. He taught her how to be gentle with the animals, how to be sturdy in the face of the wind. In teaching her, he found he was relearning the world himself, seeing it not as a place of loss, but as a place of persistent, resilient life. She was his shadow, his echo, his small, fierce companion. One warm summer evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sky bruise into nightfall. Rose was asleep in his lap, her breath a soft, rhythmic puff against his chest. Cora was leaning against his side, tired from a long day of helping him mend a fence. They sat in a comfortable silence, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of shared presence. Cora looked up at him, her head resting against his arm. "Elias?" Remember when I asked you to find a mama for Rose? He remembered it vividly, the question that had shattered his world and then rebuilt it. I remember, he said softly. She was quiet for a moment, tracing a pattern on his worn trousers with her finger. We don't need one now, she said, her voice matter-of-fact. We have you. A warmth spread through Elias's chest, a feeling so profound it almost hurt. It was acceptance. It was belonging. It was the quiet, undeniable truth of love. He looked out at the vast expanse of his land, the land that had once mirrored his own desolation. Now, it didn't seem empty at all. It seemed full of promise, a place where a broken man and two lost children had found the one thing they all needed. He couldn't find them a mother. He couldn't replace what they had lost, just as nothing could replace what he had lost. But he had become their father. He had become their protector, their teacher, their home. And in doing so, in answering the impossible plea of a desperate little girl, Elias Vance had finally, after a long and unforgiving winter of the soul, found his own way back to the light. He pulled the blanket up higher around Rose's shoulders and settled his arm more firmly around Cora, holding his family close as the first stars began to appear in the vast, peaceful sky.